Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Brad. Brad, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. We're going to talk about a lot today. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
I will, and thanks very much, Robbie. It's Brad Schreiber. I'm here in Los Angeles. I'm an author, screenwriter, literary consultant. I've also done some teaching and some work in theater. I created a TV series called North Mission Road, which was based on my book on the LA coroner, Death in Paradise. And I think what we're going to talk about a bit today are the more political things that I've researched. A book of mine called Revolution's End, which is about the Patty Hearst kidnapping, but more about mind control and the CIA. And we can also talk about Death in Paradise, my coroner book, because there's some very interesting stories about the death of Marilyn Monroe and Robert Kennedy that I think many people overlook. And if we have time, we can talk a bit about the Manson case, the Charles Manson case, because I worked as a guy who was a bus tour guide for a company called Esoteric here in Los Angeles. Esoteric is going to, I hope, start up again. They took a hiatus because of COVID, but I was doing bus tours about the SLA and revolutions, and then I was doing bus tours about what people don't know about the Manson case. So if we have time, we can dip into that.
I'm going to have to ask if we can just start with the Manson thing, because I'm not going to lie to you. It's one that it's got me before even the Kennedy assassination, hearing Tom O'Neill talk about it and reading his book, Chaos. I mean, you start learning, and one of the names that pops up is Mr. Bugliosi, that happens to be involved in the Kennedy topic as well, too. And I think if you hear Tom O'Neill's explanation on that guy, you'll have a different perspective on him.
Yeah, Vincent Bugliosi was the DA, and I can tell you a couple things that, I read Tom's book, and it's fascinating because he spent 20 years assembling information. And I don't blame him for not actually coming to a conclusion about what really happened in terms of Manson and the San Francisco Free Medical Center and Dr. David Smith and the CIA funding. I actually have some information that Tom O'Neill didn't have. When I was doing these bus tours, Robbie, the people who ran it introduced me to people in the LA Sheriff's Department. And I got information from them that Manson, when he was out at the ranch with his followers before the murders, they could easily have picked them up for underage sex. They were stealing cars, vagrancy. They could have taken them in. But the thing is, the reason they left them on the ranch, not knowing, of course, that there would be murders, was because the LA Sheriff's Department and the LAPD both knew about Manson. And they also believed, because Manson was involved in a shooting with a black drug dealer named Bernard Crowe, the LA sheriffs believed that Bernard Crowe was a Black Panther, and he was not. So LA sheriffs and LAPD said, okay, let's figure out jurisdictionally what's going on with Manson. And LA sheriff said, we'll handle it. We believe that there's going to be repercussions from the shooting of a Black Panther. And then we can sweep up not only Manson but Black Panthers, because we think there's going to be some kind of war. And of course, Bernard Crowe was not the Black Panther. There was no war, and of course, we had the horrible killings of Te LaBianca. So the LA Sheriff's Department knew very well that there was an opportunity to bring those guys in, which would have prevented the murders. That's something that hasn't been published before. My source on it is with the LA Sheriff's Department. I'm sure he doesn't want to go public with it, but it's a fascinating part of that story. I don't know what else. Yeah, what else are you thinking about, Robbie?
Doesn't that conflict with the Helter Skelter model? Like that's why that was the weird thing that Tom O'Neill brought up, was that they were trying to pin him on this Helter Skelter model. But the main thing was that Manson was mad at this guy for rejecting him for his music, saying he didn't have talent. But what the guy,
That's inaccurate.
yeah,
That's inaccurate. And I think O'Neill says it's inaccurate as well.
that's what I'm saying, is that Bugliosi lied about that.
Yeah, of course. No, put yourself, unfortunately, I wouldn't want to force you to do this, but put yourself in the shoes of Vincent Bugliosi. You're not even the lead attorney. There's another lead attorney for the case. And he basically says to the DA, who was, I believe, Evel Younger, who wound up serving later on with Ronald Reagan and is a very big part of Revolution's end. Basically, the lead attorney says, listen, these guys are all drug addicts and drug dealers. And they knew, apparently, people involved with Sharon Tate. Okay. And it looks like it was a drug burn, and then it got out of hand. It was not people bloodthirsty were like roaming around. There were connections between Terry Melcher and Manson and Tex Watson. They even were in the house of Sharon Tate. So the idea was that you cannot say that the Mansons were just bloodthirsty maniacs who were wandering around and randomly picked Sharon Tate's house. They actually knew her. Manson was introduced to her by Tex Watson. Now, imagine that you're the DA and you want these people to basically be executed because there was still capital punishment at the time of the trial. And your lead attorney's going, hey, it's just a drug burn gone wrong. And even though the LA DA's office is getting phone calls from around the world asking about these maniac hippies who are killing people randomly, it created such a stir that that's what the DA's office wanted. So they got rid of the lead attorney and made Bugliosi, who had been in the department maybe 2 years, lead attorney, because Bugliosi was saying, hey, helter skelter, everybody was mind controlled. The irony of all this, by the way, Robbie, is I know a lot about mind control in revolutions and in the use of drugs. And yet the Manson narrative that Bugliosi put forth, that the DA put forth, it wasn't about mind control, really, even though they said it was. It was about a bunch of guys who were rip-off artists who wanted to hobnob with people in the showbiz industry, and things got out of control. So that's what Bugliosi put forth, and Helter Skelter, and there's going to be a revolution, and Charles Manson is going to lead it, and he's going to help all the Black people rise up. That is patently absurd. Manson actually didn't even like rock and roll music that much. He more was like country and folk, and he was kind of racist as well. But Charles Manson, and O'Neill covered this very well in his book, Charles Manson wanted to be in the music industry. And through drug dealing, he was very close. He had close connection, not only to Dennis Wilson, but to the idea of being a pop star. Of course, if you've ever heard Manson's music, it's absolutely pathetic. But the thing is, he was supplying women to Dennis Wilson, and in a way, he was being like a pimp to get himself inside music industry circles. So anyway, the idea that Manson controlled these people is absurd. You know, they actually Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian were dealing drugs outside what Manson knew. And Manson's attitude was, hey, as long as you bring back money to the commune, to the family, it's all right with me.
Well, my issue with Biggie Losi is that he gets mentioned in the JFK topic for his book, so, I guess countering the critics of the Warren Commission through the job that they've done. And whenever I see his name pop up, I don't have any attachment to him because I'm a younger generation. I don't never really heard this guy's name until I came across Tom O'Neill's work about him. And you find out that he committed perjury in the Manson trial by putting a prosecutor on the defendant's side. And you start realizing this person that's remembered through history. You can Google him right now. You won't find a damn bad thing about him. You might find him through Tom O'Neill stuff, but the world remembers him as this great attorney and this great person. And it's kind of like, I mean, you look at Manson during the trial. Next thing you know, they're drawing crosses on their forehead. They're doing all this crazy stuff where I go, was this normal? Does this seem like people that were taking this seriously? And they go, well, they're crazy. It's like, were they crazy, or did they know that they were being basically blamed for something and there was no way that they were going to get out of it? I mean, you look at where Manson was getting his drugs from, and Tom exposed this in his book, which was that it was a government run agency. It was owned by the CIA. It was one of those places, these Haight-Ashbury clinics.
Well, now that's where Tom's research is very fuzzy, because he was not in Southern California being supplied by drugs from anywhere in Northern California. Basically, think of it this way. Manson left San Francisco and the Haight-Ashbury scene because he had burned other people in the Bay Area. Okay, this is a guy who was so criminal and couldn't think about more than 2 weeks ahead that he burned everybody he was dealing with in San Francisco, and he took the women that he basically was procuring. He was being a pimp then with these wayward girls, and he moved to Southern California. I'm sorry to say, would it be actually a more interesting story, Robbie, if we could say that the CIA was supplying drugs to Manson, but they were not, because as you well know, you've had Stephen Kinzer on, and you've had some really great people on your show. MK Ultra for 20 years was not only doing experiments on the military, they were giving money for experiments to universities and to hospitals and clinics. The Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, Dr. David Smith derived some money from the CIA, but there is absolutely no connection that Manson was in the employ of the CIA. He really was a guy who things got out of hand with. You know, Linda, let me give you an example of, and then we can go on to Revolution's End a bit if you like. Give you an example of how out of control Charles Manson was with his family. You know, your inference that Tom O'Neill's writing suggests that Manson was connected to a big network of people, maybe the CIA, is belied by the fact that Linda Kasabian was the largest LSD dealer in Boston before her marriage was disrupted and she came to California. So she and Tex Watson had their own connections, and they agreed to bring money back to the family. Manson was happy to have anybody stay with him in the family as long as they brought money in, because they constantly were in need of money. And the way they got money was through dealing drugs. Manson, as I said, used the women to procure favors. So I can't I can't really say that Charles Manson really was affiliated with the CIA.
I didn't mean it like that. I didn't mean that he worked for him. I meant like they were obviously there was some sketchy stuff going on where he was, I mean, he was under probation and they were having him go survey land where it's like, why was he in surveying land for insecticides? He said, Tom O'Neill said that on a Joe Rogan episode. I mean, was he getting drugs? I mean, people bring up the example of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Was he created by the government? I mean, I don't think that he was attached or he worked in the CIA. I just think that there was a lot of stuff going on where it was like he was getting out when he wasn't supposed to be out. If he got arrested, I think one of his Youth Ann Morehouse, I think her name is, I might be saying her name wrong, one of his young followers, he got in trouble for trying to fight a cop and stop him from doing the arrest. Then he gets out of jail like immediately afterwards. So unless there was a corruption in the force or someone got him out. And then that you would point to his probation officer having him leave when he's on probation doing these things. And I start going, I don't think he worked there. I just think they were manipulating him in a sense. They were letting him feel like he was, his delusions of grandeur eventually thought he was like this person that could do whatever he wanted. And it's like, was that was that a delusion or was that his own reality because of all the things he was able to do and get away with where a normal person would have been locked up for years? And then I bring to the example of drugs. Where do drugs come from? Who owns the war on drugs? This whole entire thing, and you start getting into this aspect of government manipulation is my idea, but I could be wrong. I don't know.
Well, yeah, it's appropriate for certain stories, like Revolution's End. But the final thing about Manson, I would say, is Paul Krasner interviewed an LA Sheriff's Department deputy who confirmed years and years ago that the LA sheriffs knew about Manson and the girls and stealing cars and drug dealing, and they left him out, as I say, because they thought there was going to be a Black Panther engagement, kind of a war. And to them, it was worthwhile. Now, there's a direct correlation between the Black Panthers and the Manson story and what happened with Donald DeFreeze, who was the nominal head of the Symbionese Liberation Army, which was a supposed left-wing radical group that existed in the early 70s. They were known for kidnapping the heiress Patty Hearst. But the real story that I drilled down into for Revolution's End is insane. It is so fascinating. First of all, the fact that Donald DeFreeze, as a Black man trying to struggle in South Central Los Angeles, was caught with petty crime, and he was given a choice of going to jail or being an informant and setting up Black Panthers, who of course were a big threat, according to Governor Ronald Reagan. And he was more motivated to undercut the Black Panthers than anything else. And in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Black Panthers and the anti-war demonstrators were more active than any city in the United States, more than New York, more than Los Angeles. Okay, so Donald DeFreeze is setting up Black Panthers on gun buys, and then finally he kind of gets out of control. And they say, you know what? You've been arrested too many times and we keep getting probation for you. We're going to throw you into Vacaville prison. So Vacaville prison was a site where prisoners would be evaluated up to 3 months medically, both physically, mentally, and then they would decide what prison they would go to after that, mainline penitentiary. Donald DeFreeze was kept there for over a year. And the reason is they were looking for people, Black prisoners, who they could use as informants to get them out of prison and go into the Bay Area and find out what's going on with the Black Panthers, find out what's going on with the anti-war demonstrators. Now,
Wait, was that the radicalized, the Black Panthers? Because that's where they started getting paranoid, where the Black Panthers thought that they had members that were infiltrating their group and causing them to kind of fight amongst each other.
it did happen later on, the FBI's COINTELPRO, but this is like 1970. So this is before the really fractionating of the Black Panthers. They're still very powerful. And so in Vacaville, in Revolution's End, I detail the fact that DeFreeze was the only Black prisoner who was willing to be freed from prison to create a phony left-wing group, the Symbionese Liberation Army, get white followers, and instead of just protesting the war, the first assignment was to kill the Black superintendent of schools in Oakland, Marcus Foster, who was a very liberal guy. And everybody on the left, when Marcus Foster was assassinated by 3 members of the SLA, the left went, "What are you doing? You're a member of the left and you're killing a guy in a historically white position as superintendent." And of course, it was suspect. And it should have been suspect because Donald DeFreeze basically had drugs used on him in Vacaville. This, by the way, was eventually noted on the day that there was a shootout and fire in Los Angeles, wiping out 6 members of the SLA. And it was published by no less than the New York Times. The New York Times, John Kiffner, writing in the paper on the day of the shootout, said, "We have done research. Not only was Vacaville taking money from the CIA and under the auspices of MK Ultra, but this guy, Donald DeFreeze, who kidnapped Patty Hearst, well, it turns out that he was an informant for the LAPD, and Vacaville was using drugs on him and other Black prisoners." This was published in the New York Times. And a week before the shootout on May 17, 1974, these 2 guys who had been working very diligently to expose all of this, Donald Freed and also Lake Headley, who had been a former narcotics investigator in Clark County in Nevada, these guys had a press conference in San Francisco. And they invited all the media, and they could only get West Coast media, but they did get the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and so forth. And they showed with documents that DeFreeze had been an informant for the LAPD, and they talked about Vacaville and the drugs used on him, and that the SLA was a construct meant to make the left look terrible, which it did. There were no, in 1970s, Robbie, there were no left-wing groups that were assassinating people. The idea was constructed through Ronald Reagan's office. He had a guy who was head of counterintelligence named William Herman. William Herman used a Black former CIA officer named Colston Westbrook to befriend Donald DeFreeze in prison. And by befriending him, he also invited lots of white radicals into prison to meet with DeFreeze and talk about what was going on politically. Can you imagine a prison that is funded in part by the CIA using a Black double agent to create a double agent so that a bunch of white, well-meaning radicals will follow this guy after he supposedly escapes from prison, and then the first thing they're told is, "We're going to kill the Black superintendent of prison of Oakland schools." And of course there was pushback, but in those days, Robbie, you have to understand that the vanguard of the movement, the radical movement in America, became very unwisely Black prisoners, because they felt that their rights had been taken away from them, and there was very unfair prison sentences that were being meted out to these prisoners. So Donald DeFreeze was the perfect guy. He was an informant for the LAPD. He had had drugs used on him, and he was very pliant. And he was considered a great leader by the white radicals because he was a Black prisoner who they thought had escaped. And they followed him blindly.
You said escaped allegedly.
Yeah, yeah. In the book, we talk about certain people that were involved in the California Department of Corrections who were involved with helping DeFreeze escape. And one guy in particular is named Lieutenant James Red Nelson. Red was his nickname. And there were prisoners who overheard DeFreeze talking to Nelson about escape. He was transferred, by the way. DeFreeze was transferred to an area that had absolutely no surveillance at all. And it was a boiler area. It was called the South Facility of the prison he was at, Soledad. And prisoners only were given that assignment in the boiler area if they were really great prisoners and could be trusted. And they'd been there for years because you could walk away from the prison. And DeFreeze got that assignment after a very little time in Soledad. So basically it was a setup. And he went to the Bay Area. He started, well, this is a part that is kind of insane and is actually secondary to the big plot. But back in the day, in the 70s, it was a big deal because Patty Hearst was the daughter of Randolph Hearst, who was the son of William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate. And it turns out that Patty and two other white women were actually seeing Donald DeFreeze in prison. They were having sex with him in trailers. The reason that Donald DeFreeze was allowed to have sex with white radicals at prison was that they were grooming him. Their attitude was, if you are going to work with us to create the SLA, we're going to have awards for you, rewards. Some of the rewards were white women being allowed to go to the trailers that were meant for only married inmates.
Conjugal visits.
Conjugal trailers, exactly. And on top of that, another thing is, obviously, I'm going to let you ask some more questions. But the other thing that fascinated me that really nobody ever wrote about in the 70s is that DeFreeze not only had these women, including Patty Hearst, visit him in conjugal trailers because he's going to be a snitch for them, he was allowed to deal drugs. And in those days, at least in Northern California prisons, they would create deals with prisoners. They would say, if you would snitch for us inside the prison and tell us what's going on about rival gangs or people who are trying to escape, we will allow you to deal drugs. And it was anything from marijuana to heroin. And the split was usually 70% to the correctional officer and 30% to the snitch and inmate. And DeFreeze was given that deal to sell marijuana. He had not been there longer than other prisoners, and everybody was thinking, "Who is this Donald DeFreeze? He's having sex with these white radical women. They're allowing him to deal drugs, and he's only been here for like a year, And the actual fact is that other members of Vacaville were asked, "Would you like to be the head of the SLA?" And they all said no. And the reason was they knew that if they sprung them and they were out as a double agent, their lives were worthless. If anybody in the radical left found out that they were snitched, they would kill them. The people that were running them as agents, their life was expendable. So every single person who said, was asked, "Would you like to work with us as a double agent on the outside of prison?" said, no, I'll take my chances in prison. DeFreeze was the only one who did it because he was broken down mentally by the drugs that he was given. And also, he had already been an informant for the LAPD's criminal conspiracy section down in South Central, as I said, setting up Black Panthers on gun buys. So he figured, okay, well, I'll take my chances. And I'll throw it back to you. But basically, one of the most fascinating parts of writing Revolution's End was talking about Colston Westbrook, that black CIA officer who was running DeFreeze? Because he was brilliant. He spoke like 9 languages. Whenever people in the media, and there were people in the media who said, wait a minute, weren't you in Vietnam during Phoenix program and weren't you a CIA officer? He would flip it and he would say, oh, I guess you're so racist that you think that because I'm working with people in prison that I must be CIA. You know, that shows how racist you are. And that's what he used to deflect criticism from him. And his relationship with DeFreeze was fascinating, Robbie. Just fascinating, and I have it detailed in Revolution's End.
I want you to explain a little bit more about the relationship between DeFreeze. Um, but I want to ask, when you mentioned him being given drugs, um, what extent did that go? Was that just LSD? Was that PCP? Was that other things that they kind of used on him? Because I'm starting to learn MK Ultra was a whole slew of more than just LSD. I mean,
Oh,
this
yeah.
this sounds like a similar situation to Operation Midnight Climax, where they were drugging people to, because around this time it was the hippie movement. The activists were protesting the Vietnam War, and they thought they could drug random civilians. People would associate those people on drugs with the hippies, and then people would hate the hippies and stop them from. I mean, anywhere you look at the radicalization of the Black Panthers. Look at all the radicalizations that go on with just Vietnam protesters, people that are trying to stop the war. I mean, there's a weird same routine or same techniques that go on. And that's why, like, when I bring that up, people go, oh, that's conspiracy talk. And I'm like, people validate it on certain things and then they drop off on another thing. If you say that the FBI killed Martin Luther King, they'll be like, okay, and then they'll gloss over the topic. But if you say the CIA or the military industrial complex got JFK out, people would just call you a nut job. And I'm just like, I don't like this. I'm going to choose what I like and choose what I don't. And you start realizing when you dive into one, the reason why it's like smelling a wine and you can smell the notes of something is because they're all the same tactics that are used. That's why, like, you get to Joyon West, who was the therapist for Jack Ruby, who was having transmissions or whatever letters with Sidney Gottlieb, who ran MK Ultra. He threatened till his deathbed to sue anyone that associated him in being an MK Ultra. And then after he dies, it all comes out.
You know, I think we talked previously, briefly, uh, about Louis Julian West, and I actually saw him testify at the Patty Hearst trial in San Francisco. So, you know, you and your listeners obviously know that he was CIA funded even from back at the University of Oklahoma. So, to answer your question, you know, you're right about drugs in the CIA. MK Ultra, 20 years, over 120 different drugs. But what they were doing at Vacaville was not really so much LSD as other drugs that you and I don't know much about that are terrifying, even more terrifying than an acid trip that goes bad. The Berkeley Barb, the alternate news weekly in the Bay Area, had a story about DeFreeze being subjected to prolixin, Prolixin. And then, so we're talking about 70, 71. Prolixin would make the prisoner so restless and jumpy that he could not sleep. Okay, he would walk around until he was exhausted, ready to collapse, but he could not sleep. And so they would, there was a certain area of Vacaville where the CIA would take prisoners and they would have them sign off on informed consent. Basically, obviously, as you know, MK Ultra used mental patients, people in the military, and prisoners because those people really had no rights, like you and I. And they would say, here, sign off on this. You're a part of this experiment. And you give us permission. And of course, if a prisoner at Vacaville said, I'm not going to let you CIA doctors fill me up with these drugs, well, they'd throw them in the hole. There were even threats to kill them. And there were people who were killed in the prison system in the 70s who were not cooperative. So DeFreeze knew that he had to agree to take the drugs. He and another prisoner named Death Row Jefferson had artane and psilocybin and other drugs that were used on them. But the most nefarious, I think, Robbie, was this prolixin, and another drug that was called succinylcholine. And that drug was basically, you know, the way in the Iraq War, the U.S. military was doing waterboarding of suspected, terrorists and so forth. So succinylcholine is like the same physiological aspect as being waterboarded. They shoot you up in it, and all of a sudden, your respiratory system is starting to shut down, and you feel like you're choking to death. So you can imagine being a Black prisoner. You're injected with this thing because you signed a consent form because you don't want to be either killed or thrown in solitary, and you're gasping for air. And doctors are saying, you're going to work with us, right? You're going to inform on other prisoners. You're going to do exactly what we say, right? You'll agree to anything because you feel like you're dying. So going through that kind of maze was DeFreeze, Death Row Jefferson, and other Black prisoners. It was completely racist because they wanted Black prisoners to be part of the counterintelligence, if you were. And they were looking for someone like DeFreeze to get spring on the outside and to subvert the movement. So even though there were 120 different drugs under MK Ultra, these two drugs, prolixin and succinylcholine, when I found out about them, I thought, my God, it's worse than we knew. It's much worse than we knew. And by the way, before I throw it back to you, it's kind of funny, but MK Ultra ended in 1974, right after the shootout and fire that wiped out 6 of the SLA members, including Donald DeFreeze. So he was expendable. Unfortunately, the whites who followed him never knew he was a snitch, never knew he was an informant for the LAPD, never knew that the CIA was experimenting on him. Had they known he'd been an informant, they would never have followed him. So that's how insidious the Revolution's End plot, well, in my book, Revolution's End, the plot to create the SLA was, and Colston Westbrook was a point guy.
I want to ask more about that shooting, and I also want to get the background behind the Patty Hearst kidnapping. Like, where did that start? How did it start? If they were obviously the public was told something different than what the official story is, and I think that's what makes it really, really hard, especially like me and you are on the same level on this. But then for other people, they're like, oh, that's conspiracy talk. It's like, well, you have the documents to back it up, you have the proof behind it, but the official narrative is so drilled into people's head where it's like so hard to realize. Like, I mean, even me, like when I found the Manson file on the FBI website, when I found the Jonestown file on the FBI website, I know this.
Jonestown is fascinating. There is a CIA connection that goes back to Brazil.
I reached out to the guests or to get guests for Jonestown, and they asked me one simple question, and they kept bouncing me around in emails so much that I got a headache and I just stopped doing it. But they were like, do you agree with the official story? And I was like, I honestly don't know the story because I heard bits and pieces, but I never trust Google. I want to hear it from one of the family members' experiences. And it was because if you read the FBI files like I have, the 700 parts that are on there, all 800 pages long, each part, you realize, wait a minute, the paranoia was being fueled because you guys were doing something over there. And then you start questioning all these things that you're told, the official narratives of things, and you start realizing there's a deeper, darker manipulational tactic. I mean, I think most of the public can get on board now that the government was trying to stop these protests and stop these radicalists or these people that are deemed radicalists by infiltrating those organizations and making the public hate them, making a bunch of things happen and divisivizing them into action.
And it worked very well, as you can tell. So the problems are multifold. People don't do research like you and I do. People are sometimes very complacent. They go, oh, well, Donald DeFreeze was a crazy radical, and these other people were insane radicals, maybe drug fueled. Well, the fact of the matter is most of the SLA, the white SLA, was college educated middle class kids who wanted to end racism and get out of the Vietnam War, but they got sucked into this plot. Patty Hearst, I'm not going to talk a lot about Patty Hearst, not because I'm afraid to, but you can understand, Robbie, I am resentful that even to this day with my book out, people are more fascinated by a white heiress being kidnapped than they are about the CIA, drugs, the LAPD, the abysmal treatment of Black prisoners in the 70s, and all that other stuff. But to very simply give you some context, Patty, when she was going to the conjugal trailers, Donald DeFreeze basically said to her, listen, I'm going to escape. Lie. I'm going to escape. And I know that you don't get along with your sisters. And how about if we kidnap them? We don't hurt them, but we hold them for ransom to use the money for the movement. And that's when Patty Hearst, still feeling that Donald DeFreeze was really a radical prisoner, who she admired, at least at that point, went, wait a minute, this is way too out of control. And she cut him off. She stopped going, but Nancy Ling Perry and Patricia Soltysik were still having sex with Donald DeFreeze and were very willing to stay in the SLA. So that's well known. That's documented. So anybody who says it's a conspiracy theory about Patty Hearst, it's like, well, she was seen by prisoners, and 2 other women were being allowed to have conjugal visits. So what is it that you can't believe? You can't believe that a rich, intelligent young woman who was a secret radical would go and visit a Black prisoner and basically secretly find out, I don't want to participate any longer. This has been exciting, but yeah, I'm going to be married, and I'm going to be a relative who's going to inherit a lot of money, and I'm not going to be involved in these radical politics and kidnapping. And so, DeFreeze and the SLA had a number of people they were going to kidnap. This is after Marcus Foster was killed, and they were basically industrialists, Bank of America, Chevron Oil, so forth and so on. But DeFreeze suggested Patty. They knew where she lived. Patty knew Nancy Ling Perry was a member of the SLA. They were in Berkeley together. So they knew where she lived, and they figured, oh, her father's got a lot of money, and we'll get the money for the movement. And also there was a lot of animus. DeFreeze, it's hard to imagine, Robbie, that you are an informant and every day you wonder whether someone's going to find out and kill you. That's the psychology of being an informant. The tension is almost unbearable. So if that's the way you live, when someone says no to you, your first thought isn't, well, I'll find somebody else. Your first thought as an informant is, you are going to betray me. You're going to either rat on me, or you're going to create more trouble for me. And DeFreeze was almost irrationally angry at anyone who would not help him. And by the way, he not only got angry at Patty Hearst, he got angry at other Black prisoners who would or would not help him. And again, it was his life on the line, but he was willing to make that Faustian bargain because he wanted to get out of prison, away from the drugs. And he, basically, as an informant, he really knew the job, and he felt that he could handle it. And of course, for a while with Colston Westbrook, it was almost a paternal thing. And then after a while, you'll read in Revolutions and that Colston Westbrook basically betrayed him and said, oh, you're the one who you created the SLA, when in fact Colston Westbrook invited all the white radicals and introduced them to DeFreeze, and he created the SLA. And by then DeFreeze went, okay, It's too late now. I should have known this would happen. And now I'm on my own. I cannot tell these followers who will follow me to their death that I've been an informant. So I'm going to be a radical. I'm going to be a real radical. And unfortunately, his life was basically doomed. And as I said to you, Lake Headley and Donald DeFreeze in that San Francisco press conference 1 week before the shootout and fire said he's probably going to be killed. In fact, we talked to the sergeant who used to run him for the LAPD, James Farwell, and he said, yeah, once it's leaked out that Donald DeFreeze was an informant for us, his life is worth nothing. And it really was. 1 week later, he was wiped out.
And when you say he was wiped out, now are you saying that they killed him?
They killed him. 500 police officers. This is complete overkill. 500 police officers, including FBI, California Highway Patrol, LAPD, and something that nobody really ever covered regarding the SLA, members of the criminal conspiracy section of the LAPD were there at East 54th Street, where they had been holed up. And I got documents that were really hard to find that proves that the LAPD really had no intention of letting any of them out alive. They ascertained that Patty Hearst was not in the house by using dogs that could sniff out. You know, they had an article of clothing that belonged to Patty. They ascertained she wasn't in the house, and they figured, okay, that's it. They opened fire, 10,000 rounds. And inevitably, and I found this out myself, the LAPD threw in 2 incendiary devices, pyrotechnic grenades, meant for outdoor riot control. You never use them indoors because they start fires. So after about a 1-hour firefight where 10,000 bullets went inside and maybe 1,000 bullets went outside from within the house, they said, okay, it's getting dark. We're in an almost completely black section of Los Angeles, massacring these people. And there are a lot of angry black people on the street. We cannot be here overnight. We've got to burn these guys out. And those incendiary devices were thrown in. And the LA Times is my source for the incendiary devices. They did such poor reporting at the LA Times that when I went through the archive, I looked up the manufacturer of the incendiary devices, the pyrotechnic grenades, and it said not for indoor use, for riot control only. And the manufacturer was later interviewed, and he was terrified because basically he said, yes, we manufactured it for outdoor riot control, but the LAPD didn't do anything wrong. He was terrified that he was going to criticize the LAPD, he would be sued, and he would lose his business. But he did say that it should not have been thrown in. So he was trying to walk this line between the LAPD intentionally burned down the house, and but they didn't do anything wrong.
Brad, what the hell's going on? Is this a problem of our media? Is this a problem with, like, there's so much stuff, like, only thing I can relate to this would be like with the Kennedy assassination. There's just too much stuff where I'm like, why did the Life magazine buy the Zapruder film? Why is Life magazine stamped at every single damn document like they're a government agency or something like that? Where I start going, the connections with media. I've had people on my show talk about the Hollywood influence, FBI invasion into Hollywood, all this stuff, where I start going, the excuse that, oh, reporters, they did their best. I don't buy that at all, because for something like this to happen, a giant event where 10,000 rounds are fired into a house, overkill on one person or maybe a group of people, but then where's the public just questioning a single damn thing? And that's when I get a little bit upset. The reason why I asked about the Patty Hearst kidnapping was I wanted to know more about that, because I started thinking, is this like one of those things where it's like, oh, it was drunk sex, so you can consider it rape or something like that? Like something where I'm like, are they just blaming him because she didn't want to seem like the bad guy and she's trying to get all the blame off of her onto him? That's why I wanted to know about what that was. I mean, the drugging thing is the worst thing, no matter who you are, what color skin you are. The fact that the government's been able to do this for the longest time and it gets labeled as conspiracy. It's where if you Google MK Ultra right now on your phone or on your computer, 2018 and 2020 articles in Montreal of lawsuits against the government are being filed by survivors of MK Ultra experiments. And it's because we've taken so long in this country to quickly label something as conspiracy and then walk away, just either because we don't want it to be true or we can't understand that the government does not care about your feelings. And they've been doing this for a very long time. And that's why I like talking about this type of stuff, because I think
Yeah,
people should know.
I understand that, and you know, you're righteous in your indignation. There are a lot of reasons why it goes on. People don't, I think, in the United States, don't like to. Well, they're selective in what they criticize. To me, it's always been ironic that the Republicans and the Democrats can yell at each other and do absolutely vicious things to fellow Americans. But when it's time to criticize their institutions for breaking the law, there's this patriotism. If you say, hey, look, I found out something about the CIA or the LAPD or the FBI, whatever, that doesn't make you any less of a patriot than anybody else. In fact, I would argue that you're saying, I love this country and I want it to be law abiding. But also, part of that problem is not only the inherent ideas of Americans about Americanism, what we're doing right in the world, therefore we're not doing anything wrong. Also, I believe that there's vertical integration of the media. And so the more corporations control what you hear, it's all independent stuff. Most of the authors and people that you meet, with some exceptions, I'm sure, basically publishing books, Robbie, that are from independent media. Every once in a while, like David Talbot, they get a major publisher. But the problem is that they are not embraced by other people who review. It's not enough to publish, and it's not enough to find the documents and publish it. You also have to have the other media embrace it and say, hey, look what this author found out about. And then you need to have the people say, hey, this is intolerable, like we did in the 70s with the Church Committee and other people who investigated the CIA. That should be going on all the time. When was the last time that the CIA or the FBI was basically holed up in front of a committee? It's eternal vigilance, and so your frustration, I feel very much. But at the same time, I don't want to leave your audience with the impression that nothing has been done. Revolution's End also talks about the Determinate Sentencing Act that Governor Jerry Brown came up with, because kind of what happened in the 70s with the Black prisoners and the Black prisoner movement was out of the fact that prisoners could get sentenced from a year to life for something like being at a robbery without having the gun and nobody is killed. Can you imagine getting a life sentence for that? But the prisons were filled with prisoners who had gone to what was called the Adult Authority in Sacramento, and they randomly gave them these sentences that were arbitrary and awful. So that changed in 1976. Prisoners who were ill were not treated humanely in the 70s. Now a prisoner can literally sue a penitentiary if they have a medical problem that they don't basically take care of medically in the pen. That didn't exist in the 70s. They would actually motivate prisoners to do what they want by not giving them the drugs they needed for medical problems. It was absolutely barbaric. So at least that has changed. There's a lot of things we need to change about the prison industrial complex. Well, we should also note that some things have actually been affected positively, and that we need to continually disseminate information. That's the key to it. That's the key to change, I think, socially. And my last book is about change through music. I did a book called Music is Power. Rutgers University Press published it. And it's every kind of music you can think of, from Union songs up to anti-war. There's country music, there's punk and metal, about social consciousness and change. And you see that, at least through music and artists, they've never given up on the idea of changing society for the better, at least through music.
Well, I think music is a great. I mean, everyone in my family is a musician. I'm the only one that didn't follow that route. But music is a great expression. Just captures a feeling. It really captures a tone. Whether you're feeling sappy, sad, whether you're feeling happy, whether you're feeling angry, whatever. I mean, the punk movement was a big one. I mean, people chalk it up to just anarchists wanting to tear down establishments, or it's just people really questioning the idea of wanting change. There's a lot of things where people have felt like the only way that they could speak out is through a song or through some type of movements. And these movements gain large following for a reason. I mean, hell, we'll bring it back to Manson. Manson thought that John Lennon's Beatles White Album was giving him secret messages or something like that.
That was the story.
Yeah, I know.
That was Liosi's story. Actually, it was Manson's too. But Manson was feeding LSD to his followers and giving them a line of crap. And basically, he was ripping off people for drugs, and he got over his head,
Well, we land in a land where, like I said, I'm a patriot at heart, but the thing is I don't identify with a political party, mostly because I feel like if you identify either left or right, when you're looking for corruption, you're going to be more happy to find it in the opposite side rather than look for it in your own. And I think you have to question things, and there can't be double standards on them both. I know that's more of a controversial take, but I also don't like, I think secrecy is needed, but I think you need to start questioning a lot of these actions that gets out there. And we're way too quick as a society to, like, if you say anything about Trump or if you say anything about Biden, people identify with that. And then they take, like, it's like talking trash on your hometown. You can do it because you're from there, but if someone else talks trash in your hometown, you feel this sense of patriotic pride to defend where you're from. And that's exactly what we do with our political parties. And it shouldn't be like that, because then how do we ever see progress? I mean, I'm not a visionary thinker in that mindset.
Yeah, law and order, Robbie, is law and order. If you believe in the law, that means that if a Democrat breaks the law, or a Republican, or an independent, or a Black person, or a Polynesian person, or a white person, the law is the law. And when you do not apply the law equally and justly, there's a failure in democracy, no matter what your beliefs are. So that's the way I feel about it. It isn't that I have it out for the CIA necessarily, or the FBI. It's about injustice, and to me, it's the more that our society is governed by secrecy and controlled by media, who sometimes really aren't that regressive, but it's like self-censorship. Imagine if you're a daily newspaper investigative reporter, and you find out something in your city that is so corrupt and venal that it will really topple heads. You can go to your editor and say, we've got to do this story. And the editor's like, wait a minute. If we do this, it's going to impact certain relationships. My job, your job is going to be on the line. So news, yeah, I think people should think of it this way. The news that we learn about in the major mainstream media is stuff that is so obvious that it's okay to talk about it. But if it isn't obvious, and if there's going to be a detrimental effect by talking about it, especially to the people concerned in the media organ, whatever it is, TV, film, internet, whatever, you're really up against it. You're taking a chance. And the idea is we will either say that you're a conspiracy theorist, or if you have the documents, and we can't call you a conspiracy theorist. We will minimize you. We will not give you the press that you deserve for finding out about things. And so and it's much worse, of course, in other countries. So that's where this Americanism, this pride gets ameliorated. It's really tough to change things, but imagine if you're in England, where they have the Official Secrets Act, and it's even worse. And of course, in repressive regimes, I mean, Putin actually kills his journalists, and there's no doubt about it that he's doing so. So imagine being the average Russian citizen who wants the truth to come out, but it's like it's going to be a death sentence if you tell the truth. So we have the capability of changing this society, whereas with Putin, it's very, very difficult. And with other countries that are repressive, it's really a challenge. So we should feel good about that and work on that.
Can I ask just one last question, which is just what got you started down this route? Like, what got you writing about these types of things? I mean, this isn't like, obviously you probably might have had an idea of like maybe I'll write a Bob Ross book, something maybe a little bit more happy, but even if you look there, it's a little bit of a dark story as well too. But I'm just curious. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I've written about everything. I have like, I don't know, 12 or 13 books. I wrote a book called What Are You Laughing At?, which is about humor writing, because I used to have a comedy group. You wouldn't think of a guy who's an expert in mind control in the 70s.
They beat it out of you.
I love comedy. I love history. I'm very much a historian. But the thing that really got me, Robbie, was when I was in college. I was more your age, and there was a presentation at San Francisco State about the Jfk assassination. And I heard things that I said, how could they possibly ignore this forensic scientific data and say that JFK was killed by one person? And I was fascinated by that. And then, of course, Watergate also was a fascinating incident about corruption. And I knew about the SLA when I was a very young man. And finally, I got the records from Dick Russell, a very good researcher. And I said, okay, I've got all the information. No one else is going to write this book, Revolution's End. So I have to be the one that is going to do it. Otherwise, why did I get all this information? Why did I spend all this time? But it really started, with JFK. And a lot of the people that you've had on your show are people that I've met over the internet, and I really respond to. Jefferson Morley, Jim DiEugenio, Lisa Pease, who wrote the greatest book about the RFK assassination, which we didn't get into, but maybe another time. It's a fantastic book, not only proving that the CIA had officers present at the Ambassador Hotel, but that probably there were at least 2 shooters. And it is so well done. It is so definitive that after you read the book, you go, it's not theory at all. So I really admire a lot of the people who do this kind of work, and I'm glad you're doing your podcast.
Thanks, Brad. And I appreciate the time you've given me to be able to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find your books? Any Twitter links you have? Any social media links?
Sure. BradSchreiber.com is my website, which has got a lot of video and audio about my books. I'm on Twitter at Brad Schreiber. I've also got a Facebook feed. And I would close by saying that there's a book that I co-written with Ron Stallworth. He's the guy who wrote Black Klansman, which was made into an Oscar-winning movie. So he and I have collaborated on a book that Macmillan is got, and I hope that early next year we're going to see that book out. And it's basically called Hip Hop Cop. And it's not only about his trying to do anti-gang stuff in Utah. The Crips and the Bloods in the LA gangs moved into Utah when he was working there. And he told everybody in the state that it was going to happen, and they all ignored him. and then crime just exploded and the drug traffic exploded in Utah. I was like, oh, gee, maybe we should have listened to this guy. So half the book is this narrative, and half the book is the political nature of rap music in the 90s. But the book is about a lot of things. It's about government's failure to, in their backyard, address drug traffic before it's too late. It's also a book about the nature of racism and policing, and it's also a really compelling story, very much like Black Klansman, where he's up against the establishment and they don't want any part of him, and he's like, screw you, man. I'm here to uphold the law. And if you're not going to help me, I'm going to basically go right by you. It's a very inspirational book. So I think Hip Hop Cop should be coming out early in the new year from Macmillan. And I mentioned Music is Power, which is also about socio-political music for 100 years.
Well, I'm excited for that new release coming out in the new year, but I'm going to link all your links in the description. Brad, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.